what makes Reclaim special and why we have thousands of happy, active daily users is that it is a non-intrusive, friendly little robot that helps you make time for things that are important to you. That's probably the single sentence I can say. And the way it does that is it gets ahead of all the chaos, hopefully, the chaos being your life, your coworkers, the business you work for, all the, whatever the thing of the day is. And it's looking out at least a few weeks and trying to defend and block off time so that when people are looking to schedule meetings on your calendar, there's less time available than there used to be, is the short of it.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Patrick Lightbody. Patrick is a third-time entrepreneur, the co-founder of Reclaim.ai, a fascinating artificial intelligence startup promising to help optimize time box and defend your schedule from distraction and meeting creep. Patrick is a self-professed data nerd and has long roots in automation and big data, being involved early with projects in companies like Selenium, OpenSymphony, and new Relic. In this conversation, we discuss Patrick's journey into making things, his early involvement with important open source projects, the importance of uncovering the stories behind the data, the dangers and benefits of automation to society, how Reclaim.ai was born, how it helps you defend important blocks of time for what matters, and where Reclaim might be going in the future. Reclaim is a fascinating product, and even though it's still early, I find it very useful in defending my time with minimal effort on my part. It gives me hope that smart people are not simply trying to build systems to monitor and track us at work, but actually start with taking the individual's goals and needs into account. This connects beautifully with last week's conversation with Dr. Lior Zalmanson about algorithmic management, on the more humanistic and positive end of the spectrum. So let's jump right in with Patrick Lightbody. So I'm sitting here with Patrick Lightbody, co-founder at Reclaim.ai, and then we're going to hear all about it in a moment, I'm sure. So Patrick, welcome to Remake Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
Awesome. I like to start this question because I find when I talk to people, there's often a thread that kind of leads them to where they are today that you can find the origins to fairly early on in life. And I like to start a conversation by asking, what's something you discovered or learned in childhood that still drives you all these years later, that still drives you today? And I know it's a hard question, so you can take a second to think about it. I'm sure you can find something.
In childhood, gosh, the one that instinctively jumps out at me, which is not, I will admit, frankly, that original. I think there's a lot of, in particular, white men in technology who give this answer. So I admit it's not that original. But I did get into video gaming in like middle school, and my parents never bought me any sort of Nintendo or Sega. I guess technically we did have an Atari. That was the only console we ever owned, was an Atari 2600. But then I jumped into computers and started with an Amiga, and then later a PC. And it might have been because I didn't have any video game systems, as all my friends did have like the Nintendos, I was like starved for that kind of experience. And so I got into PC gaming, and that definitely got me sucked into the world of tech. I originally thought I was going to go build video games. And I then later learned that that's incredibly difficult. And so I built web apps instead, which is much simpler. But I would say, and that's an answer, like I said, a lot of people give because it does suck folks in, but it got me into building both the computer. So there's a bit of like hardware and a bit of problem solving mentality. The idea of just creating things with software stuck with me. And so that was kind of my first exposure to software in any sort of sense, as like level design of video games and very small basic mods. And I built my first C program was a Tron video game, and I didn't know how to like control the speed at all. So when I upgraded my PC, the clock speed was so much faster. Like the little thing was like zipping around like crazy and impossible to control. But it was a good experience for this idea of creating something new. I took software classes at the night school. I grew up in San Jose, California, and our local community college had programming courses and whatnot. And so I did that at night to try to learn. And by the time I went to college, I thought to myself, oh, you've already learned like some of the software creation process. You should go do like hardware. So I started off as an electrical engineering major thinking I could go in a different direction and then put it all together. It just didn't click. Like I literally couldn't. I just wasn't into it. My brain didn't work that way, even though it's still techie stuff. It just like software creation was what I like wanted to do. And so I sucked back into it and actually changed my major halfway through college to flip back over to software. So obviously I've stuck with that since.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if I can draw a thing all the way to what we're doing with Reclaim exactly. That's childhood. Other than just this innate desire to create things.
Yeah, I think you're right that a lot of us who grew up around that time, I think through games and through really cool digital experiences, learn what a cool thing it is to create. And I definitely had a lot of these like paint tools and animation tools when I was a kid, and like programming and games. It's just, is it a feeling of power? Is it a feeling of like, oh, this is so cool? Or what kind of vibes with your experience?
Yeah, it was the act of making a little change and seeing it digitally on this screen. I'd say the moment where it really clicked was when I was first learning how to make web pages, and it was Gopher still was around. So I know this was like pretty early on, but it was like there was also basic HTML, and Yahoo was still like, I think, a gray background and blue and purple links. But just like being able to view source and see how this thing was constructed and build my own little web page, that really felt empowering. Certainly the game creation, there was a lot of that too. And that was more fun in a way. But with the web pages, that was the first time where I felt like I could build something that other people could see and experience. And it just suddenly, I was like, oh, there's this like multiplication effect where it's not just, oh, here's a level in Doom where I can go and blow monsters up and enjoy it just myself. But this was like actually something I could create, and I could give someone this URL and they could go see it, and then I could change it and they could see the changes. And that definitely opened up my imagination to basically the beginning of the internet and the opportunity there.
Yeah, that's super exciting. Yeah, I remember my first HTML experimentation. That was so powerful, and also felt like a secret language because most people didn't know it at a time. And it was like, oh, I can move things around, and it's like everything updates. And
I will say, just this isn't going off on a thread here for a second. I regret that technology has gotten so there's layers and layers now of frameworks. And this is how technology has evolved, right? Transistors. We had a transistor, and even before the transistor was other tech that I couldn't possibly begin to explain. And we've just layered things on top of it until we have iPhones and the whole interface and software that goes with it. But I do regret that there doesn't seem to be that kind of like view source experience that I think people of our generation experienced in the early days of the internet, where it was still not so abstracted away that it was like you could understand it. If you try to view source of a React-based web page today, you're not going to, understand anything. And it's not to say there's opportunities to learn. Of course, people are learning and taking a step back. But what is out there today at the consumer level is so abstracted and complicated that the consumers that are consuming it cannot pick it apart and see it like they could of the yesteryear. And I do think that's a little bit of a bummer. I think it's been offset My oldest child is my daughter is 9. And I think it's been offset by things like Scratch Junior for younger kids, Swift Playgrounds. She's been using that more lately. So I think that there's things that are offsetting it, but it's not quite the same thing if it's not a thing in the real world that you can actually pick apart and understand.
Yeah, it's
and
like
I do think that's I think that's a little bit of a bummer.
It's interesting. I wonder because I definitely know 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds that can use Xcode and can create very real apps. It's not as source codey, maybe completely as before, but in a way you can create something that goes into the pockets of millions of people, theoretically. But it's not like you can't do it when you're maybe 7 or 8. Maybe like it's more complicated. So this is super interesting. And so you took this attitude of experimentation and hacking things, hacking cool things that other people could experience. And you go, and I think you got a computer science degree.
Mm-hmm.
And then what was next for you in terms of building something?
Yeah, I got sucked into, while I was at university, I got sucked into open source. And I think that was just a continuation of that thread. I stumbled into it. I was just trying to build stuff for I had a almost full-time job. It was like 35 hours a week working at Cisco Systems. And that was a great opportunity. It helped pay for college. I learned a lot, wrote some really awful Perl code. And it was a good experience, but I also needed I needed to just push myself because they were actually asking me to do a real job and I didn't, have all the answers. And so I found open source and got pulled into a community, and that's a whole interesting discussion one of these days. I found myself in the IRC FNet Pound Java channel chat room where I was learning Java and learning the open source tools that were there. And there were just some amazing people that were in that early community. Yeah. Both the founders of Atlassian were there. I met them and did some work with them in the early years. And the founder of Elastic was in that group. The first CTO of Square was there and a few other folks. And I look back at it, I'm like, man, I really underperformed relative to my peer group.
Quality IRC buddies. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, but pretty much, just stumbled into open source and through that then met these amazing people who were going off and doing their own startup. And here I am working at, Cisco Systems. And I'm like, oh, this startup thing sounds pretty cool. Like, I'd like to do something like that. And so I didn't have any idea myself of what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to keep working at some mega corp, because especially in the early 2000s, late 90s, like Cisco was like the thing. And so I was like, it's probably time to move on. It was a good experience. So what should I look at? And I just basically started looking on job boards at early stage startups. And I landed at one that did and does have some roots in what we're doing with Reclaim today. It was basically, I describe it as the other LinkedIn of the time. And so if we'd made a couple slightly different decisions, I think instead of everyone knowing LinkedIn, they'd know Spoke Software. And that was the company, the startup I worked at, another amazing group of people that came out of there, but the product just wasn't quite right. But I joined them as a software engineer, and I thought to myself, like, this would be a great place to hone my craft and learn from smarter people and also see what it's like to be in a startup. And so that was really where I started my career post-graduation.
Cool. And what was your experience? How was that different from, I mean, I can imagine, but how is it different in your eyes from Cisco, from working for a big company?
The first thing was the team I was in at Cisco. I was a lead engineer, which is absurd to describe because I was this like still in college kid who had no professional experience, but most of the team was not full-time on the software stack. Like I was in the support department. And so I was like the full-time engineer who wrote tools for the support team. And then other people pitched in and helped out. And it evolved over time. And there were other engineers that kind of came on board. But for a long time, like I was like the senior engineer, and so I had to learn via open source, learn via the communities, learn by making lots of mistakes. And then when I went to Spoke, I immediately in the job interview process, found myself with engineers that were just like head and shoulders more experienced and much smarter than I was. And so right off the bat, I was like, oh, I'm a little intimidated. I'm going to learn things, but also am I up for my ego getting a little bruised? But fortunately they were okay with hiring me, even though I didn't know all the algorithms. That was probably one of my mistakes in college because I was working. I convinced myself that on the job experience was, by far more important than learning the exact algorithms of bubble sorts and things like that. And so I wasn't particularly good with the classic computer science, even though I got a degree in it. And they said I could hang out with them. And the engineering side of things were pretty good. I learned a lot. I, gained confidence again and pushed my own kind of frameworks and technologies and solutions. But the thing that was, I'd say, more interesting it was my first time actually having a real professional mentor. And so I just happened to be, and this part definitely sticks with what we're doing with Reclaim, but I just happened to be, it was dumb luck. I was living in San Francisco, right near the Caltrain station, and the company was down in Palo Alto. So I took the train to work, and our head of engineering also took the same train at the same time to work. And so we often just sat there, and he wasn't, during the working days, he had other stuff to do, and I had a different manager, and I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but basically had like almost an hour at least once, if not twice a day, where we could just catch up on things. And he was a very seasoned entrepreneur and executive and really challenged me. And so I remember like probably the first thing he said to me that at first it shocked me a little bit. And I was like, who does this guy think he is? But really stuck with me is he asked me to write a status report. And I really hadn't had anybody like holding me accountable to even where I was spending my time. And so I did my very first status report, and I wrote something like fix some bugs. And he grabs it one day, like on the afternoon going home. And he's like, what is this? What is fix some bugs? What does that mean? That doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell you anything. Like, you got to be precise. And he really drilled into my head the power of language and precision and communication, both to elevate and connect with your teammates, but also just to hold yourself accountable, because it's so easy for you to just say, yeah, I did some stuff. It's okay.
That's
that measurement,
move.
Yeah, and some could be a little bit, it could be a lot. You could convince yourself that it's just fine. And he was really good it's a little tough sometimes, but very good at getting me to recognize that. And it gave me confidence as I evolved and adapted and took his guidance to heart. It gave me confidence that I could get into the business side of software more so than just being a software engineer. And probably the biggest thing that he taught me that I carried with me from that moment on and continue to is the importance of being strategic with how you think about how you want to spend your time. And so one of the things that in the act of writing my status report that I evolved into with his coaching was not just writing down like tasks I wanted to do and tasks that I got done, but very specifically writing down no fewer than 3 and no more than 5 kind of key priorities that were my guiding light for any given week, and anchoring myself in those things and making sure that my colleagues all knew that was what was driving me, and making all my decisions around those kind of medium-term priorities. And that's quite literally the management style I brought with me as I grew through my career. And then later, the actual first version of the Reclaim prototype that we built last year. And it was, when you asked that question, I was like, video games got me on my track, but it wasn't my childhood, but it was like my first job where something really stuck with me that I can trace all the way to what we're doing today with Reclaim.
That's awesome. And it sounds like he was a fairly sophisticated PM in terms of, or at least thinking alongside like agile methodologies or daily stand-up sort of thing where you have accountability every day and transparency. That's awesome. And from there, it looks like you took a turn into the world of QA. And so I'm curious about that. And also your involvement with Selenium, which is something that, first of all, something that we use, I think, since about 2008 or so. And so that's fairly early. I think you were probably, that's the time you were deeply involved in that. So yeah, I would love to hear how you got into it, and how does that relate to your kind of the wanting to build things for other people, it's really interesting.
What launched me into it in the first place was actually that same mentor at Spoke Software. He was challenging the whole team on quality related issues. And he described, a vision he had personally of, wouldn't it be nice if there was like a spreadsheet of like very simple kind of almost English style commands that would say, do this, expect this. And just after each build, the spreadsheet would turn red or green, depending on whether the thing was valid or not. And what he was basically describing is a certain style of test automation that exists today.
Everywhere,
it was not fully procedural down to JUnit. It was like abstracted away. And so because he was someone that was very influential for me, I took that and just said, okay, let me see what I can do. And most of my early time was really spent around like literally the Excel plugin. And we had a shared folder, and you just drop a Excel file in this shared folder and the program would pick it up and run it. So it was pretty hokey, but it was like an initial start.
That's hardcore.
Yeah, the actual browser at that time was a browser emulator. And so I was using, I think it was called JWeb Unit or something like that. And so the ThoughtWork folks were like, oh, we built this thing internally. You should check this out. And so that's how I got hitched up with that project. And then after I left Spoke, I moved up here to Portland, where I still am, to join a company called Jive Software. While I was there, the product was evolving. There was more needs to continue to push some of the quality automation. And so that's where I really spent some time with Selenium, helping Jive automate some of their stuff. And in the process, I was also contributing back to the Selenium project. And so eventually I built the kind of next part of Selenium. It's called Selenium Remote Control. And it just, without getting into all the nitty gritty details, it like basically helped Selenium get more broadly exposed because it bypassed a few technical limitations and just helped create a lot of popularity. And ultimately that turned into like its own little community that kind of split out from that other Java community I was in. And for a period of time, I was running and managing both. My vision was OpenSymphony is a little cottage industry for Java projects, and OpenQA is a little cottage industry for open source test automation projects. Selenium was really the only one that ever got had legs and had sustaining power, but we had a few other projects there.
Yeah, and Selenium really took over. And I remember this was probably my first real experience of automation affecting people's jobs that I knew, because it was... We had 2 QA people at the startup that I was working on, and they essentially did the spreadsheet thing. They basically had a spreadsheet and they had to check things. And then Selenium came in and we realized, okay, we'd have to pay one person more because they'd be more technical knowing how to manage this.
Yeah.
But they'll be able to get so much more done and we'll get results like that. And so what do you think about the automation aspect of this and as part of the overall trend that we're seeing?
Yeah, and societal impacts, and it's a complex topic, right? I mean, that one person who got a job and got to grow his or her career is probably very happy for that change. The business might have been more effective because they were more productive, and maybe that resulted in wage increases eventually for more people. But say those 2 people, if they actually lost their job, like they're not very happy. And I think there's real issues, whether it's browser automation or self-driving trucks and cars, that we have to face as a society. Yeah, there have been a number of kind of unintended consequences just in my own little, and in the grand scheme of things, I'm not like some huge open source contributor. I'm sure there are people who are working on ML platforms, or folks who are part of like Linus, or who are part of something like massive. My contributions to open source have been relatively small, but even those, I've had a few where I'm like, did I create something that was on the whole a net improvement for society? I think so with Selenium, but there were clearly in that open source, and also a couple of my startups I did, consequences of that automation and efficiency gained, including some human consequences for sure. I will casually admit I don't take anywhere close to full responsibility for it. But one of the open source projects that we made in the Java community, OpenSymphony, it was something called WebWork. WebWork eventually merged with Apache Struts as we were sort of winding down the community and figuring out where to send things off. WebWork became the new Struts 2.0. So the deal was, we'll take the tech will go over here, but the brand and the governance and all that will be Apache. And I was not solely responsible for it, but I did make some of the choices around like the security and tech stack that went into that. The Struts 2.0 tech stack was what was used at Equifax.
Wow.
And it was one of the sources of their problems. Now, they didn't patch it. There were known issues. There's lots of issues, layers and layers of what led to that giant, fiasco. But there's a small bit of it that was Patrick Lightbody choosing this particular expression language 15 years prior that had these cascading effects.
Wow.
And so I do think open source contributors and technology creators in general do need to be mindful from time to time about the choices they make and the consequences they can have. I think in particular open source, that you sort of convince yourself that it's this free thing you're giving away, and so you don't use at your own risk. And to some degree that's true. As things gain popularity, you get benefits of it, right? Your career grows, your worth grows in terms of people knowing your name and wanting to hire you and things like that. I think it's important to be mindful of the entire contributions of your work and to think about that from time to time. Not feel like guilty and dwell in it, but definitely know that technology can be very powerful in many different directions, good and bad.
Yeah. In terms of Selenium, I think it was a net plus. And even the two people that I was talking about, one learned Selenium and built their whole career on top of it, and the other became a product manager. And I'm sure she's happier than doing the rut work of QA. Yeah. And so overall, if we do this right, it could be a positive thing. You're a self-proclaimed data nerd, from what I've seen. And you, in addition to QA and building experiences, you also worked a lot in big data and using that. Most of our listeners are going to be designers, entrepreneurs, but not necessarily super technical people. Mm-hmm. And so some of these people, when they hear data, they just fall asleep, or they imagine a massive spreadsheet with numbers. So why isn't data... So what's your relationship with data, and why isn't it boring?
Yeah, if it's a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet, it is boring. What's interesting is the story behind it. And so it's all in context of, what's actually happening. How did I get into some of this data? One thing I'll just say is, tying back to my first mentor, when he asked me, you fix some bugs, even there was a level of precision, right? He was asking for data. Which bugs? How many bugs? How many? Was that more or less than last week? Those kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because he was looking for more numbers in a spreadsheet. What he was challenging me to do was to be aware of my story. Was I distracted last week? Did I find a groove this week? Was I blocked by some particular issue that I needed, help on, and then I needed to raise the flag and say, let's bring a more senior engineer in here to help me, get unstuck. And so I've always tried to remind myself that it's not that, the data is pointless if you don't think about the story and the reason for it that's behind there. I will encourage all of your listeners, if you have, I'm guessing most of them have not seen this, there is an excellent video. It's gotta be 10 years old at least, maybe longer. I don't know, called, and I'm just going to look it up while it's here so that I can direct people to the right place. But it was Look at Your Data was the name of the talk. It was only a 10-minute talk. Yeah. Okay. So it's 2011. It's almost 10 years old. And if you just Google Look at Your Data Velocity, I know that'll bring it up, kind of top result. And it's a gentleman who was at Amazon at the time. I don't know if he's still there. And it's 17 minutes. Okay. It's a little more than 10 minutes, but he basically talks about this a little bit about sometimes it's easy to get lost in the numbers. And it's important. In his case, what he's arguing is sometimes it's important to stop aggregating numbers and stop getting blinded by the overwhelming data and get really close to it, look at it. In his case, he describes actually literally printing printing out log lines from Amazon's web servers and printing them on paper and having 40 sheets of paper spread out on the floor so that he could like literally crawl around in it. I don't think you need to do that all the time, but he highlights in some funny ways the importance of looking closely at the data and not getting blinded by the what gets lost in the aggregations of it, whether it's a line chart or some headline number. And so if anyone's even interested in challenging themselves on data related topics, I found that one clearly I can remember it 10 years later, an influential way to anchor yourself in the concept of data and the importance of it. A year after that I was already in the world of monitoring and testing, which was naturally, kicking off lots of data. So I was already in that world. But it was about a year after that video was posted that I joined New Relic, which I'd say was where I spent a lot of my time really thinking about data. And early on, the stories and the things that I was, pushing for was still about technical monitoring. But even there, the problem of data could be so lossy. And so let me give an example for the users that they experience all the time. I'm guessing most of the time when they browse the web, pages load quickly. And then sometimes they just stick there and they're just like not going anywhere and everything's really slow and it takes way longer and you notice it. And that, by the way, that's a log normal distribution curve. And that's really common in technology because the vast majority of things can load quickly, especially in distributed systems, because when things are working well, you might have 5 hops to like the web server the browser talks to the web server, which talks to an API, which talks to a database. And each one of those things has like latency and a little bit of time to talk to it. And 90% of the time, all those things perform quickly and fast and they come back. But there are some rare cases, and that's this like long tail of experience where something isn't cached or a DNS record is not available and it has to look up a new DNS thing or the disk is swapping or whatever it might be. And suddenly those things start to elongate. And now that user experience, instead of being a 3-second page load, is like a 30-second page load. If you average all that data up, it's 3.1 seconds is the average page load response and you don't have a problem. And yet you might have 10% of your users that want to throw their keyboard through the window because this thing is, terrible and slow. And so that dialogue, that explanation, that was actually and it's rooted in that video that I just described. That was probably one of the biggest inspirations for me to really like up-level myself and the products I was working on in the idea that you can't get away with just aggregating data anymore. You have to give your users better tooling than your kind of classic, it's a sum or a count or an average. And so that opened my eyes up to, there are so many stories and nuances that are embedded once you get past those aggregates. Why are those users having long response time? Is it a particular server that they're getting routed to? Or is it something unique about the user? If all of your users or 99% of your users have 2 records associated with their account, but then you have this one user that has 10,000 records associated with her account, her experience is terrible because you never designed the software for that crazy amount of data, right. But you lose it if it's all averaged together. So all I would say is data matters because people matter. And everything behind the bits of data is some user who's got some sort of real experience, some sort of paying customer, whatever it may be. I know user is sort of a vague and sometimes overloaded term, but if people aren't doing anything, there is no data really, unless it's like, I guess, right. The temperature data, various passive stuff. But in the world of software, data is almost always associated with some sort of interaction of people. And businesses, to be successful, need to understand how their people are using their software and what makes them happy and why they might want to buy their software and stick with it. So most of my career has been around the performance side of it. Why is this thing crashing? Why is this thing slow? But later, both because we were building products in this direction and also as my role as the head of product management at New Relic evolved, later I became very interested in understanding kind of the business context of how users were using the software, not just the technology part of it. And by the technology, I mean, was it crashing? Was it fast? The business part of it is what leads people, what user behaviors lead people to want to purchase more of this software or to decide to cancel their software. And so those are the questions I started asking myself to make the New Relic business better, but also to offer it through products, capabilities for New Relic customers as well.
Interesting. So you talk about data and understanding the user better. And you also, in one of your talks, you talked about the burrito button, which is just the ultimate convenience. And in one button, you get a burrito, and how amazing that is. And I love that. At the same time, there's all this backlash now with, I don't know if you've seen The Social Dilemma, the Netflix.
It's funny you say that. I've had 3 different friends mention it in the last couple of weeks, and my wife and I were going to try to watch it Saturday night, and we didn't get the kids to bed and all the dishes done and all that until 10 o'clock. And we looked at each other. We're like, oh, we're wiped out. It's going to have to wait till next weekend, but it's on our list.
So I just watched it a couple of days ago. And the thing that really jived with me is everyone's trying to get data on people and to create a model of what is this person going to be interested in? What is this person going to want? How can we make it a little bit more convenient?
What kind of fake news will they share?
Exactly. What's going to get their attention, get them to engage, get them. And I'm on this opposite trend where, and the movie talks about this, where I've disabled the feed on Facebook, and I've disabled even Siri suggestions on my phone because it pops up the apps that it thinks I'm going to use next, and that makes me use them next because it's in your face. And then in the movie they say, if you're going to watch YouTube, don't watch the suggestions. Like, they're programming you through the suggestions. Find something you want to watch yourself.
Yeah. Yep.
And so isn't that the other side of data? And we're going to get to Reclaim and which I think is a great use of data, but where do we draw the line between what's too much?
Yeah. No, humanity has got to really wrestle with this. It is a big issue. For what it's worth, my wife and I, we both also deleted our Facebook account a couple months ago. We were just fed up. We were done with it. But I'm finding several of my kids' classmates are all asking them to get on Facebook Messenger for kids. I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently it's a thing, and I'm terrified of it. And my kids they've completely become enamored with Minecraft, and then more recently watching Minecraft videos on YouTube. Right. And that thing it's terrifying to watch them get sucked into it for 2 hours. So we're locking things down. I'm definitely familiar with this problem. Yeah, I don't have any deep thoughts here other than I hope there's a role for some sort of central governing authority where we can keep ourselves in check. There's an interesting, I wish I could remember I'm sure it's a famous science fiction author that came up with this idea. There's this big philosophical question of what becomes of the world and of humanity as we embrace automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all the things that we're wrestling with as a society. You can see 2 inevitable outcomes. One is where a single company, which unfortunately feels like we're moving in that direction, where named Apple or Amazon or Google or one of 5 right now, continues to get so large and so successful and just buys up everything else. And if you pull that thread, you can see it may take hundreds of years, but you get to a point where basically one person owns all the robots and all the technology and everyone else is a slave to it. And that we're all dependent on it, and all the wealth has moved in that direction. Because at least we've had wealth disparities forever, but at least when you had physical labor as a part and armed forces as a part of how you defended that wealth and power, there were finite limits to it. The most we got was the Roman Empire, for example. But when it's all virtual and when it can all be automated and it can all be done for pennies on the dollar, it does beg the question, can you get to the point where a single person is effectively in control of everything? The other way, the much more enlightening way, is you think about worker productivity having improved by leaps and bounds over the last 100 years. And yet somehow we're still in this like grind where we convince ourselves we still have to work at a minimum 40 hours a week. We still have to go shopping on the weekends and keep the economy moving in this very traditional way that's been the way it's worked for at least 100 years. And it begs the question, like, will society figure out how to use the technology in a way that benefits everyone? And instead we end up in this utopian society where people can do minimal amounts of work and do work that pleases them and is artistic and creative. And the robots that automate everything are all here at our pleasure, serving us grapes on platters. I don't know, but I hope we figure out a way to move in that direction. I do think that the pace at which things are moving is going so fast that if we blink, it could take leaps and bounds in the wrong direction. I think, frankly, what we've seen with like COVID in just the last 6 months shows how fast the wealth and technology can concentrate in a very difficult and struggling society. And so hopefully we use these as lessons to put some checks in place as a society. And that will include how the data is used, what rights consumers have, how we educate consumers as best as we can. I don't think it's appropriate, the Zuckerberg style view of it'll just work itself out. That's a very kind of classic libertarian view that a lot of the technology leaders are taking. Evidence suggests it's not working itself out. Evidence suggests that kids are becoming more and more addicted to stuff that is almost provably not helpful to their growth and maturity. And yeah, I hope that we wake up and that we put some guardrails on there. Yeah, I don't know.
That's a hope we all share. And then I think I'm definitely very worried about some of the same things. And one of the things that we need to be able to deal with all of that is reclaim our time and have more time to think about these issues and to do work that matters. And so I think that kind of leads us into what you're doing today, which is super interesting and probably why we had this conversation to begin with. So tell us how this all started. Why Reclaim?
Yeah, and then I'll come back to some of the data questions because, as you noted, we're capturing a decent amount of data about our users, and there are definitely questions of trust and questions of intent that I think all of our customers should ask of us and that we need to ask of ourselves as we grow our own business. So I'll circle back to that in a second. But yeah, the vision for Reclaim, as we chronicled, I basically spent most of my career in various technology products and monitoring and testing and things like that. New Relic being the most recent version of that. I will say I did a brief stint at another data management company for about a year. I had to travel almost weekly down to the Bay Area from Portland, and it just wasn't good for my life or my family. So I didn't do it for very long, but it was a great experience. And one of the things that this company does is recognizes that for developers to create great products that really raise the bar, they need access to a lot of data. But at the same time, I don't think anybody wants their personal data just sitting on some developer's laptop nilly and being used in who knows which ways. And so what I loved about this product was it both made it easier to get access to realistic production, almost real user data, except it would get scrubbed and transformed to non-real things. And so Patrick Lightbody would become Fred Smith, and my real home address would change to 123 Main Street, and so on and so forth. And so it was masking the data out and transforming the data so that it was still useful for the technology to evolve and be used as test data, but without potentially hurting the people that use the software. And so that also has been in the last few years, an important kind of anchor where I've thought, okay, this data problem is real, but it's also solvable, and it can be solved with technology and good intentions and thought out kind of leadership and policies. Yeah, back to Reclaim. Basically, Henry, my co-founder, and I were both product leaders at New Relic, and we were asking ourselves, like, hey, we've concluded that we like each other. There's a match here. We want to go start something new. What should we do? And naturally, we started with something adjacent to the space we are already in, because that's where we're comfortable. We know this world. And so we started just talking to friends and taking the lessons we'd learned from our time there. And what we were hearing is a lot of people were saying, look, it's great that I've got access to metrics and charts and crash reports and things like that about the quality of my software. Frankly, I've got enough of that. What I'm struggling with these days is understanding, is my team being effective? Are they actually building the right product? Not just is it a product that doesn't have bugs and performs quickly, but is it even the right thing? Is it pointed in the right direction, or are they just wasting time building a high quality wrong product? And there's different versions of that. One version is the CEO sets a direction or the product manager sets a direction and it's just wrong. And in some cases, that's just instinct and judgment and research that needs to be done. But in other cases, the direction is right, but the execution is wrong because, say, the product designer is unable to spend enough time with the team, or the product manager had some idea, scribbled out a basic idea of it, but then couldn't spend the 4 or 5 hours in the cubes and the working spaces and all that with the engineers to answer all the questions and help them figure out where all these little decisions had to get made, because the product manager is being asked to also go and save some 7-figure big enterprise deal by, pitching them the roadmap and promising them that all their complaints that they're raising and threatening to cancel their contract will be resolved next year. And these are real things. Like every product manager, in particular in enterprise software, I'd say can connect with this, like where you're having to choose, do I do X or Y? And that's what got us thinking about this is, okay, initially, Henry and I thought, can we figure out if a team is effective by just looking at their bug tracking systems and their outages and pulling in a bunch of data. And then we derive that and say, oh yeah, they've fixed more bugs than they did last week. And there've been 100% uptime and there've been no new crashes. They must be healthy. But it turns out, as we mocked out that idea with people, they're like, yeah, but I still don't know if I built the right thing. I still don't know if my team is moving in the right direction. And that got to the question of time, because every time you ask, why do you have that doubt? It was always the leaders I depend on at different levels in the company are almost never around to reassure me that we're moving in the right direction. They're constantly there's constant competition for their time. And so that got, and we recognize ourselves. As a product manager at New Relic, I joined when I was the first PM. When I left, I want to say it was like about 40, 45 people in that organization. And there was not one moment ever as a role as an IC or as a role as the head of the department that I didn't have a calendar that was just, super impacted, and that I felt the stress of making trade-offs all the time. And so I got it instinctively because I lived it. Henry did too. And so we held that for a second. And then we asked ourselves the second question, which is, there's frameworks or business leadership frameworks that people try to deploy to solve this as well. For example, OKRs, or before OKRs were very popular with Silicon Valley in the startup world, there've been cascading goal systems probably for decades. I'm guessing there's business books written in the 40s that probably had some version of this. The one that's well known, for example, at Salesforce and found itself in other organizations is the V2 MOMS: vision, values, methods, objectives, metrics, if I remember correctly. OKRs are objectives and key results for the listeners that aren't familiar with that. But they're all basically the same idea, which is leadership at the very top says what they're trying to accomplish, no more than a few kind of important initiatives, and then cascades it down to the layers of management below them, who each review those 3 to 5 objectives and come up with supporting objectives. And the idea is that by the time it gets down to those super stressed out, busy professionals, that will be their guiding light, per my kind of original mentorship that I experienced. And they'll be able to make the right decisions around what to say yes to and what to say no to, and they'll be able to lead their team more effectively. And all this stress that we were hearing shouldn't exist. It did exist. And these were companies that were deploying OKRs, and they were, and similar. And so did, New Relic had a version of that too. So the question is, why was that happening? And what we were finding was that at some point, as these things cascade down, they stop becoming instructive and they evolve into becoming more of a justification. And what I mean by that is a director of engineering might get these things cascading in, and she might say, cool, I would really like to make sure my team of 30 people are all going in that direction. And I'm going to do my very best to ensure that. But, we just had a massive outage last week, and none of the objectives align with service quality, but I'm hearing it from the leaders of this company that this was unacceptable and we cannot have this problem again. So I'm going to have to also spend time with that outage. And so either they just can't fully get all of their stuffs oriented towards that, or what happens actually more often is they identify pieces of work to say, solve that outage. And they squint and they say, that actually is somewhat related to that objective we're trying to accomplish, because it's going to touch that part of the code. And so they flag it and they say, yeah, we're working towards that objective. Not really, but we are. And this doesn't happen because people are dishonest or malicious in their intent. It happens because they're under incredible strain to do a bunch of things. And the leadership that is cascading these goals down, it's really a leadership problem on their part, because they're failing to see what the true capacity of their organization is. And they're not auditing and inspecting the departments and seeing what the key, leaders are up to and where their stresses are. They're just shoving things into the system. And frankly, I've actually seen it become a little worse with these OKR systems, because it gives you a feeling of, oh, now we have a piece of software and we have a model for how we deploy these things. So I can just plug it in at the top and the machine will work.
Right.
And it doesn't really work that way unless you actually find out where the time is being spent and give the people in the organization the autonomy and the support to say no and to stop doing certain kinds of work. You can't just keep shoving stuff down from the top. And Henry and I experienced that. We heard that a lot from New Relic customers. And so we said, okay, is there a way that we could align the interests of those leaders who are not, necessarily, they're not bad people either. They're just trying to lead their company with the tooling that they have and the techniques that they have. Can we somehow align the interests of those busy managers that are in the middle and the kind of lower end of the organization and do something for them that can also eventually help those leaders better see what's really happening in their organization? And so that was the vision for Reclaim and how we were born. And our goal is to make first the life better for those individual busy people. The things I think about are when you're not in control of your time, when you haven't reclaimed it, you're doing stuff like, and very destructive behaviors that a lot of people willingly admit they do. Things like checking your email late at night, sitting on the couch next to your spouse, not talking to them, half asleep because you're not getting enough sleep, trying to just get through your inbox because you didn't get through it during the middle of the day because you were in so many meetings. And so many people are feeling this right now because of COVID and the fact that meetings seem to have gone up now because people are struggling to collaborate as effectively as they used to. And so they're compensating with more scheduling of meetings. And of course, if you have family members, you may be also dealing with the fact that you're in a shared workspace. Those family members have various schedules they have to keep and so on and so forth. And our vision was, let's help those people first get control of their life. And in the process of doing that, let's guide them ever so gently towards the very thing that I was coached in my first job down in Palo Alto, anchoring myself in a few key priorities for my work and a few key priorities for my life, and reminding myself that it's okay to triage and deflect, decline, or delegate the things that don't align with those interests, and to, in a safe way, communicate that eventually to my management so that they can understand how I'm choosing to spend my time. And ultimately, I hope that we'll build more and more products and capabilities that, in a safe way, get that information all the way up to the leaders of the companies without betraying trust and all the concerns that would go with that, per your points about data, and hopefully get better companies, better leaders, and better professionals. Everyone's a little calmer, I hope.
And so if you could put it in a sentence or a kind of very pithy thing, because there's productivity tools of all kinds, to-do lists, project management tools, calendars, scheduling software.
Yeah.
What's special about Reclaim?
Yeah. Today, what I just described to you is like our long-term vision, but we know you can't You have to take your first few steps. And so what makes Reclaim special and why we have thousands of happy, active daily users is that it is a non-intrusive, friendly little robot that helps you make time for things that are important to you. That's probably the single sentence I can say. And the way it does that is it gets ahead of all the chaos, hopefully, the chaos being your life, your coworkers, the business you work for, all the whatever the thing of the day is. And it's looking out at least a few weeks and trying to defend and block off time so that when people are looking to schedule meetings on your calendar, there's less time available than there used to be, is the short of it. The simplest problem we solved that is pretty universal is the personal calendars and personal commitments. It's a super simple problem, but it's unsolved in calendaring platforms today. And that is, I've got a dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment, or I have to pick my kid up from school, and I forgot to block it out on my work calendar. And because the way calendaring systems work in the corporate world now is if it's not blocked out, it is up for grabs in most cultures. It's not entirely true. There are some cultures where nobody can see whether you're free or busy. That is increasingly very uncommon. In fact, we did some kind of surveying. About 80% of our Reclaim users not only allow their free busy time to be seen, they actually allow the full details of their calendar to be seen by default. I don't actually embrace that. I think that's a little more transparent than I personally prefer. Yeah. But though it makes sense why people are moving in that direction, because for efficiency reasons, it has become easier to just plop a meeting down. I'm not saying this is right, but it's just become easier to plop a meeting down and then kind of assume that the recipients will come, and they do, because saying no and disappointing your colleague is hard emotionally for a lot of people. And so most people just do that and they go on autopilot, and then they regret it later, but they don't regret the one decision they make because it's compounding. It's like potentially hundreds of acceptances over many months before you realize you're in this like crazy treadmill. Yeah. So what Reclaim's doing is just blocking the time out for personal commitments that might show up on your personal calendar. And then more recently, we expanded into what we call habits, just things that are important to you, whether they're personal or work. Getting food in the middle of the day. You hear about this all the time with people who are working from home unexpectedly. They're forgetting to change out of their PJs, let alone get themselves an actual nutritious meal in the middle of the day. Yeah. And so blocking out time for that, and blocking out time for work-related things like actually catching up on your inbox or writing your weekly status report, just things you might otherwise sacrifice when it's not top of mind. And so we're doing things like that, and now more recently tasks, but it's all about just defending your time in advance and trying to be the better angel on your shoulder.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm a user, and I've been using it for probably about a month, maybe a little over. And the way I've come to think about it, which really is a GPS for your daily life, because things happen. I have a meeting maybe last minute for tomorrow or for later tonight, and that is going to affect my plans. And there are certain things that need to get done but won't get done today, or I won't have enough time to give them today. And I don't have the time to rejigger my calendar every single time when that happens. And just knowing, and it's clearly, I can see that you're going places well beyond that, but just knowing that, okay, you know what? I made a wrong turn, but the week is still fine.
Recalculating.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's really powerful. Another thing that I found super powerful is the habits, because there's just so many things that I wish I could do in my weekly routine. And I need to practice this, and I need to do this, and I need to do some fitness, and the wish list is huge. And that's actually, and maybe I want more things than are possible. Maybe they don't even fit in my calendar, but until some intelligence tries to put everything together and tells you, you know what, this is not going to fit. Or you're going to do some reading next week, but you can't read every day because you have too many other things. That's when you start feeling the limits of what's possible and making better decisions. So I wonder, And we both know John Zaratsky, who wrote the book Make Time. And Make Time is all about how your calendar gets filled up with crap that from other people and how to defend it. And so this is such a good implementation of it, but I guess it didn't come from the book or from...
No, although now that we've become aware of it over the last year, we definitely are reading it and their blog post as well. So I'd encourage your listeners, they've got a really cool blog as well. I think it's maketime.blog, maybe. It might be the URL. You can just Google Make Time book. But yeah, John and his partner Jake are very focused on helping people who are struggling from these same problems take control and take a little accountability, but also take control of their time. And a big part of what they teach is recognizing you need to be strategic in how you think about your time, recognizing that you've got to make room for habits and that it's work. Habits aren't just like a thing you just like, oh, now I'm going to do this habit. I think anyone who knows this on January 1st, when they decide they're going to get fit again, knows that it doesn't always stick and you've got to work hard to keep it up. Yeah. And that you need to also make time and block out time for intentional work because the persona that they're speaking to and that we are also building products for is this persona who is to some degree constantly victimized by the needs and demands for time from other people. That is like literally the way the corporate world works these days, is if you're in that kind of what I would call the middle management layer, where you're not so senior that you have a full-time assistant who is there to defend you with shield and sword at all costs. Right. And you're not the individual contributor who mostly just needs to be head just down, but you're what is basically, I've got to go do, some calculations and figure out the numbers, but I would assume it's somewhere north of 50% of the working population, white collar kind of workers and corporate environments, where you're in that middle management layer where you are inundated with meetings, whether you manage people or you manage projects. And it's crazy, and you're there to fend for yourself. And so we're both speaking to those people, and people are very stressed out right now. They were stressed out before COVID, but they're incredibly stressed out now. It's really nice to meet a fellow traveler like John, who is thinking and writing about this stuff, and to get a chance to show him our product. And when I was first discovering some of their writings, I was like, oh my God, this sounds very aligned to how we're thinking about this. And so it was great to also just get some validation that we weren't crazy in how we thought about the solution.
Yeah, and they're spot on, I think. And I actually interviewed Jake for the podcast. It's not out yet, but it will probably be out before this is out. And so we actually didn't get to. We only spoke about sprints, so we're scheduling. We're scheduling another one. But I think so. Another book that kind of comes to mind when I think about Reclaim is Indistractable by Nir Eyal. It's a fairly recent book. Have you read it? Or have you seen it before?
I have not, but I'm going to put it on my list. So tell me more.
It's all about So Nir Eyal is famous for writing Hooked, where he's showing us the research on how to build addictive products. And that was many years ago. And now he's doing a turn and saying, okay, this has gotten out of hand. Let me do a book for people about how to defend their time and not get hooked and become indistractable. And the most useful thing in this book, I think, speaks to Reclaim so much. He says, you can't claim that you're being distracted unless you know what you want to be doing at that moment.
Yep.
And actually, if you're doing what you planned on doing or what you intend to do in that moment, by definition, you're not distracted. And if you're doing something other than what you intend to do, by definition, you're distracted. And so for me, it's great because now I have this Reclaim. I open my calendar.
It's a little bit of a roadmap.
Yeah, I know what I'm supposed to be doing. And I want to talk to you about trust, because I need to trust the system, and I need to trust that it's expressing my own wishes back to me and not dictating for me. But assuming that I get past that, and I mostly do, I open it and I am supposed to be doing yoga right now. If I intend to do yoga this week, this is the time. And so if I'm checking Twitter or Facebook, I'm distracted. But if I'm checking Twitter and Facebook under the rubric that says social media time, half an hour a day or half an hour a week, then I'm not distracted. That's what I intended to do. And so how do you think about that? How does that?
No, that fits in exactly with how we think about it. The trick is sometimes people want to call an audible. They want to change it up, and they might say, I can still work out, but I'm just like, sometimes it's procrastination. I know I should work out right now. I've got a couple hours free. Now is the optimal time to do it. I'm just not feeling it. I'm going to punt that to tonight. I'm sure I'll get to it. They may not. And instead I'll pull forward. And it doesn't even have to be stuff like social media, which is easy to criticize as candy and distractions. It can just be like, yeah, I'm going to code right now. I'm just feeling it. And so sometimes it can just be feelings. Other times it can be literal, like logistical issues. I can't get to the gym. No, setting aside COVID, all my examples that involve physical locations start falling apart. But I can't go work out on the treadmill because I'm watching the baby right now because my wife had to go run to the grocery store and I'm the one responsible for watching the kid. And I can't be on a treadmill if this kid's crawling up behind me and going to get kicked in the face or whatever. Or it might be my leg hurts, whatever it might be. There's lots of reasons why people change their plan. And so the biggest thing we think about with Reclaim that we have more work to do is to be with them in that process. And one, to make it low guilt. We don't want you to feel terrible using our software and more importantly, just like living your life, but also make it low friction. If it's harder to make those changes with our product than it is to do it without, then we're not doing you a good service. And so I'd say that's the trickiest thing with time management and calendar management is we can lay out a foundation over the next few weeks of what your roadmap should look like. But when the moment comes, either that day or the day before or the minute before, sometimes things change. And we need to, in order to keep that trust, we need to be there be with them and help them through those decisions. There's no question that sometimes they're bad decisions. Sometimes they're very legitimate, like I've got to watch the kid or I'm injured or whatever it may be. But sometimes it might actually just be like I fell off the wagon. I'm no longer, I just chose not to do it today. And so that's where it's like, we want to make it low guilt in the moment, but we also want to give you an opportunity to reflect on yourself and to change your behavior and make better decisions the next day. And I don't have all the answers for that. We're a small company. We just hired our 5th person. We've got a lot more work to do, in particular around the design of the product as we think through some of these more complicated workflows. But I do believe that from a first principles standpoint, we needed to start with a foundation that involved asking our users what's important to them. And we didn't even get in, right now Reclaim doesn't even get into like work priorities, some of that stuff I was talking about earlier. We're just asking, like, broadly speaking, is it important for you to exercise? Is it important for you to get lunch? Is it important for you to stay on top of your inbox during regular working hours as opposed to 9 or 10 o'clock at night when you should be spending time with your family? I will say my favorite habit that I have on my calendar is to hang out with Everett, who is my almost 4-year-old. And I like to do that sometime in the middle of the day just to get his energy out and wrestle with him and all that. And like, that was me taking some of those lessons I had, years ago for my mentor, not necessarily about work, but recognizing that it's important to me to spend time with my 4-year-old because, they're only that age for so long and they change a lot in the next couple of years. And I want to enjoy that time. And so it's nice to know that we've been doing a lot of fundraising the last few weeks. And so we've had lots and lots of meetings, but even for as many meetings as I've had that time defended because that's my priority.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I use it also for things like this that would just get trampled otherwise. I'm trying to learn the violin, so I need that 30 minutes of practice every day, and I need to find it. And it's been helping me do that. And so, yeah, it's a wonderful thing. So I wonder, and we're nearing the end of this, but I wonder as you go into the future, and not just about Reclaim, but more broadly, our relationship to this machine intelligence that's going to manage more and more of our daily lives. Where do you see this going, hopefully positively? Where could this go?
Ultimately, what we want to do with Reclaim, and I think what I hope technology does for humanity, is it gives people leverage. It gives them powers that they didn't have before, and allows them to be their best version of themselves. And I would say getting sucked into 8 hours of YouTube videos is not the best version of yourself. It might be the best version of Google and the YouTube revenue team, but it is not probably for most people the best they can be. My vision for Reclaim is that in the near future, our customers can, instead of managing the minutia of their calendar and all the stresses of delegating or declining and disappointing colleagues or getting stressed out because they got double booked for a doctor's appointment at a sales call at the same time, that instead Reclaim is giving them a low stress way to interact with higher order concepts that give them more leverage. And so what I mean by that is they can, pull a lever and say, this is really important for me for the next week. This kind of work or this project is really important. And Reclaim helps go and negotiate and rearrange their schedule to achieve that result. And obviously there's all sorts of questions of trust and transparency, and no one wants to be embarrassed by a robot that made a bad decision, canceled your meeting with the CEO to make room for that project. So there's lots of stuff for us to work out there. But ultimately, it's leverage that you can pull that lever, and lots of things that were otherwise stressful for you to do, and even more stressful for you to, and when I say stressful to do, like the literal movement of rearranging and rescheduling, right. But then there's the bigger stress and challenge of actually not doing that and going to all those meetings and not achieving the thing you want to get done. Now you're depressed and you're overworked. And so that's ultimately how we think about Reclaim. And I think that's how we should think about technology as a whole, is that automation and intelligence, if it gives you leverage, it makes you stronger and more efficient as a person in your job, in your personal life. That's great. That is wonderful. If you can speak into a phone in Spanish so that you can have a better dialogue and a more humane dialogue with the person who helps you with your landscaping. It's, as first world problem as that sounds, I know people who have landscapers who barely have a conversation with the person that works for them because they don't speak Spanish. And that's tragic. It shouldn't be a reason why two humans who otherwise actually see each other on a regular basis and both have families and have wants and needs and dreams can't connect with each other. So that's leverage, right? That's great use of the technology. And self-driving cars, that gives you leverage. God forbid, we're a long ways off from this, I recognize. But when the day comes where we can safely transport people without having to keep their eyes and hands on the road, you can go on a road trip and have 8 extra hours to read Harry Potter to your children. That's leverage. You're buying back time. So I hope that we have more of that utopian view and we move towards that. And I will always look at it through leverage. I think the counter side of that, though, is people need to be able to opt out. They need to be able to understand what's happening. They need to be able to know how their information is being used for non-transparent purposes, like in the case of watching a whole bunch of YouTube videos and how they're feeding a system. In our case at Reclaim, because I promised I'd come back to this, I think part of how you build trust in these systems, certainly you've got to do a good job and you got to make them feel like they're getting some value and they're gaining time. I think design is an important part of it, like just literally making something look good and feel right and be intuitive helps build trust. But another part of it is giving them kind of an emergency exit pull cord or emergency stop pull cord. Right. And so in our case, it was important to us from the very beginning. We offered a delete my account if you don't like what it's doing. And we've had users who got freaked out. They didn't like how we were putting things on their calendar and they deleted their account. And then they came back a couple days later as they got more comfortable with it and maybe opened a support ticket with us. But I think technology has definitely made it difficult to opt out, and the whole world of tech and automation needs to give people those emergency breaks and let them turn it off and even go so far as to opt out and delete it. And I'm really thankful actually that California and Europe have led the way. Europe first, they should get credit first in some of the regulations that have pushed companies to implement these kinds of systems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Patrick. This was super interesting. As a final word, is there any place people can go to find you or Reclaim, what you do?
Reclaim.ai is our business. And so you can check it out. If you are on Google Calendar, we don't support Office yet, but we're working on it. If you're on Google, you're welcome to sign up and let us know what you think. It's going to be a free product. Some parts of it will always be free, and some parts we're going to start charging for early next year. But we'd love to hear from your listeners and see if we can help them be a little bit better version of themselves. And if you're at all interested in engaging with me and want to make fun of some of my past open source contributions, for example, or anything else, trust me, there's plenty of things that I look back at. I'm like, really? You wrote that? But if there's any reason you want to engage with me, I'm on Twitter. I'm Lightbo, P-L-I-G-H-T-B-O. And you can find me there.
Perfect. Thanks, Patrick.
All right. Thank you.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.